Welcome to No Forks Given. I am Neha, and today I have on my podcast Neeraj Singh, also known as Neeraj Miraj. Neeraj is a London based costume designer working across film and television who is shaped by a global perspective. He is of Indian origin, born in Fiji, raised in Australia, and now based in UK. Neeraj brings what he calls a fractured cultural identity into his storytelling, using it as a powerful lens to uncover character, nuance, and emotional truth through costume design. His work has featured in critically acclaimed projects and received a lot of recognition. His most recent work, Hamlet, is just out in the theaters in UK and soon to be in the US. Welcome, Neeraj.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Neeraj, you're aware that the aim of this podcast is to engage in conversations about identity and to explore the complex layers of identity through food as a metaphor. And the first time we met was over a meal that you had created, right? You had made this amazing fish and shrimp curry, and I was pretty blown away by it because when I realized what your background was from Fiji to Australia to UK, I have to be honest, I was not expecting the dish to taste so authentically Indian. That got me really thinking about following those breadcrumbs and trying to look at Indo-Fijian history. And since you mentioned it was a recipe that your mother had given to you, I was pretty fascinated by the fact that the je ne sais quoi of Indian cooking was still retained in it over 4 or 5 generations. And I found that between 1870 and 1917, about 1.5 million Indians were taken out of India as labor by the British after slavery was abolished, and about 60,000 of them went to Fiji. And by 1940, they were about 48% of the Fijian population. That made them the largest. And by 1970, Fiji gained its independence. And by late 1980s, there were a lot of tensions between Indo-Fijians and native Fijians, which led to a lot of riots and emigration of Indo-Fijians to New Zealand, Australia, and other areas there, right? I want to start with you. Like, you were born in Fiji. At what age did you leave Fiji?
Yeah, so I was born in Fiji, in Suva, and I was 3 when we emigrated to Sydney.
So what was food like? I mean, obviously, if you were 3, you don't remember what food was like in Fiji, but what was food like at home for you in Australia as an Indo-Fijian?
I have this. I have one memory um of smells. I was at my father's side of I'm Punjabi on my father's side, and I remember that they had a big farm, and I remember the smell of boiling milk. That was one smell that I really that's etched in my memory from Fiji. I think that is yeah, that's one memory I have. Other than that, food, I don't really remember cuisine. But what was my food like in Sydney? In
Yeah.
Australia?
At home, yeah.
At home? Yeah. So at home, predominantly we ate Indian food, Indian dishes. Um, and it was all types of curry, meat curries, veg curry, um, khichdi. We had, yeah, it was varied, but it was predominantly curry and
Yeah.
Hindustani food.
So, see, this is fascinating to me that the food that I ate, that you had cooked, which was being made in your house in Australia, is Indian food that I would also eat in India. And this has skipped about, I don't know, 5 or 4 generations of being in Fiji, where the recipe has retained itself. See, the Indo-Fijians, when they left India on those boats, the caste system was very rigid in India. And so at least the Hindus would have had to compromise on much of the do's and don'ts. Even crossing the seas was one of the biggest taboos. If you went overseas and came back, you were already, untouchable, so to speak. So to get over that and then go to a new area where ingredients must have been restricted, though historically, wherever the indentured Indians did go, whether it was Mauritius, Fiji, or the Caribbean, they were followed by Gujarati traders traditionally that opened grocery stores. So a lot of the ingredient was available. But food has also become a metaphor in Fiji for some of the tension that was brought up between native Fijians and Indo-Fijians. Because I was reading about George Speight that you and I talked about, who was a national radical, and he commented on the fact in the 1980s that the Indians need to integrate more, and he alluded more to their food, given that he himself was known to enjoy a good curry. I mean, have you ever heard conversations like that from your parents about what it was like in Fiji? And do you even eat traditional Fijian food in your home?
We do actually. We eat like there are Polynesian dishes, which I actually up until recently thought that they were Fijian Indian or Indo-Fijian food, cuisine, but
Yeah.
actually they're Polynesian food where they have there's a lot of taro and cassava and root vegetables um, and coconut milk, and so those are the bases. Are all kind of lovos where things are cooked underground, which I knew was more Polynesian. But there are certain dishes which I was actually talking to my mother about, asking her. I was like, "Well, what about this Fijian Indian dish?" She said, "No, that's
Yeah.
Polynesian." So these had been adopted culturally for us. But I think what's really interesting about what you said about the the movement of people from India to Fiji. What strikes me so much is, it's such a perilous journey across the seas, and many didn't make it. But I love that the priorities somewhere was a spice. That they
Yeah,
that they will leave out, they're not going to leave their spices.
and about one third, only one third of the 1.5 million actually went back to India after their contracts were over. But they lost, the rest of them are said to have lost all contact with India, which is why the fact that they were clinging on to their food and their recipes and being accused of not integrating. Though, I mean, in Fiji, a bit divide and rule would have aggravated this concept of, hey, these are Indo-Fijians, and all the policies were treating the Indo-Fijians, from what I understand, as temporary there. And so as they decided not to go back, didn't know where to go back, it aggravated that divide, leading to some of the tensions coming over, but again defined by the food. The Indians were being defined by the food. And I was also reading about the divides, North Indian and South Indians in Fiji, among the population, that would jokingly refer to each other as kata pani, which is sour water for the southerners because of the sambar and all the tangy curries, and whereas the South Indian origin Indo-Fijians would refer to the North Indians as kuris, which meant they were mingy and not as liberal on the spices. So it's just funny to me that it continued. And of course, there were Muslims and Sikhs and people from Punjab. Your father, you said, was from Punjab also. So there must have been a melding of cuisines which turned into Indo-Fijian. But when you're talking about these Polynesian dishes, are you talking about Polynesian ingredients getting into the food, or is it that the entire recipe is Polynesian? Because areas like Tonga and Samoa, I mean, traditionally they don't even have a history of seasoning their food, from what I understand, and I'm not an expert. And they are now starting to eat a lot of Indian food, even in canteens and cafeterias, where it's becoming popular, and Indian curry powder is also being sought after to season some of the food. So do you think it's an Indianization of ingredients, or is it a pure Polynesian recipe?
I think they were mostly Polynesian dishes because
Yeah,
even though they felt to me, because my mother had made them, that they were
yeah.
Fiji and Indian, they didn't have spice, yet
They didn't have spice. Got it.
they
Okay.
felt they felt like a. But what's interesting also is, even growing up,
Yeah.
even if we were to make a pasta sauce, the pasta sauce, there's nothing subtle about cooking with an
In
Indian
India.
hand. Now, pasta sauce can taste like a curry or have the consistency of a curry. I think it's a style of cooking which which is by Indian hand, which kind of just default makes a curry. I can't make anything. I can make very little in a subtle way. I don't know subtlety.
And so what was it like then? What was it like in Australia? Were you being seen as Indian, or were you being seen distinctly as Indo-Fijian? Um, because I find that, it's almost like losing your home twice. First India with your ancestors, and then you're losing Fiji and you're going to Australia. So what did that feel like?
I can speak from my experience, because for my experience, I felt very othered in Australia
Yeah.
because it didn't feel. I knew that I wasn't from there,
Yeah.
Whereas in Fiji, I didn't feel a lack of feeling Indian. It was more like I wasn't. I was Indian in Australia, and I wasn't from there. I was other.
Yeah.
Um, a- and so, yeah, I guess, it was, and it manifested in ways where, you feel your differences. Even going to school, if I had a roti wrap with bindi in it, it was like a
Yeah.
little bit. I knew that, again, there were the smells. There was like it was just something that was different when everyone was having sandwiches and you were having bindi roti. And
Yeah.
it I I I I didn't do that very often because I just wanted to assimilate, really. And it was a big difference. It was a very noticeable big difference if you weren't having what there wasn't that much diversity in cuisine and in lunch boxes like that.
And it's interesting that it's identical to the experience that my kids have had in the United States. And I'm a first generation Indian who moved here as in my late 20s. And my kids went through the same consciousness about the food and their tiffin that you're experiencing. The meal was probably identical too, right? And how would that experience in Australia compare to your experience in UK though?
Well, I feel, there's a when I arrived in the UK, strangely enough, I felt more connected to culturally when I moved to the UK than I had in Australia. And almost in a sensory way, I felt something that I hadn't felt since maybe early childhood in Fiji. There was something about the way the gardens are, the roses are, the buildings are in the UK, which somehow just gave me this sensory feeling of being back in Fiji and also being more connected to to my culture. Um, because there are so many, second and third generation established communities of Indian diaspora in the UK, and the food is everywhere. We're very much, perhaps maybe not accepted, but very much integrated into life here. Um, and yeah, I really connected. I really connected in this way that it wasn't just, I guess, whereas in Australia we would have been first generations going to school in Australia, but the majority of the community were very sort of segregated and contained culturally. Whereas, in the UK, there was just so many. The population is so great that you feel like just another person.
And what has your relationship with Indians been? Have you traveled to India?
I have actually. Do you know
Yeah.
when I traveled to India? I traveled to India in 2010 with my
Yeah.
with my mum. We were on a my mum had been several times before, but we were on a shopping trip for my sister's wedding,
Yeah.
and we had done from the north to the very south. We were from Amritsar all the way down to the very south. Then we went to Chennai. Then we went to Bombay. We did Bangalore. We did this incredible journey all through India, and it was really special. I think it was like 8 weeks, and we had gone. We were doing things culturally, going and seeing the sites whilst we were shopping. So we were engaged and had some function that we had to right, some function to our purpose to our trip, and then also like experiencing things in a culinary sense, so it was really. And then also there was that first time of feeling like I'd never felt this feeling of, wow, I really feel like it's mine, or I belong
Yeah.
here. I felt anchored, unlike in a way that I hadn't felt in Australia or the UK or Fiji. I had never felt that sense of being anchored. Um, before going to India, and I think I think also in turn what that does, the positive, I guess, that I take away from that is also that I have have had this fluidity. Um, you know, I guess when I describe myself having a fractured cultural identity, I'm meaning that I'd never quite felt that I fit or I belonged or I was from Australia or the UK. I always felt sort of this other, and also in our our ancestry in Fiji. There's 4 generations in Fiji, but we never thought to delve, to research, to try and find this ancestry. We just existed, up until now. Now I'm very
Yeah.
intrigued to find out what my roots are. But before that, we just really merely not existed. I think we were surviving and providing, and those were the goals. And the goals weren't to figure out where our roots came from. But so I had this fluidity with I never felt claim on anything or feeling this patriotism or feeling like I had some strong allegiance. Um, but going to India, I really felt this. this connection in this really palpable way. It was amazing.
It is quite fascinating, right? When it comes full circle, 4 generations later, and you feel a sense of being home. Naipaul was also a product of the diaspora. I was born in Trinidad and Tobago, and um, he's written a lot, though, as an insider with an outsider's point of view of Indo-Caribbean ethnicity. But he often talked about how Indians see the world in such a hierarchical manner. And he almost put a mirror to me. The first time I became self aware of how we talk to people and how we want to place them before we start talking to them way back in the 90s, it sort of blew me away. And I think he was right to some extent, how the first few questions are about placing you in this complicated grid that they have in their head. And did you feel that? Like they're not, there is an ownership when it fits that grid, and there isn't, depending upon where you are vis-a-vis where that person's own perception is of being on that grid, which is complicated. I'm not judging it, but it just is. Did you feel judged? Did you feel accepted and acknowledged, or was it different based on where you were with the Indians?
Oh, I think yeah, it was different. I think the UK is extremely accepting.
Yeah.
Um and
But that's
into
because UK has such a deep relationship with India, right? Going back 300 years. It's complicated, but it's there, right? And
yeah.
they understand the nuances of Indianness, including taking Indians to Fiji. They're responsible for that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But then also I think there's an acceptance and also an acceptance of the differences within the
Yeah.
diaspora here as well as the collective, so that, whereas in Fiji, I think no matter where you came from, even though there were these kind of somewhat derogatory terms for where you came from in India and the divide in Fiji, I think eventually it amalgamated. I don't see a South Indian Fijian Indian and a North Indian Fijian Indian. I don't see the
So
differences.
it's melded. It melded. And I mean, I hear about an integrated Indo-Fijian cuisine as well, though I have not eaten anything other than what you cooked for us, which was fabulous. Um, Now that you've been in UK for about 23 years, right?
Yeah,
What do you think about so the UK's relationship with India and Indian food is also very layered, and I've alluded to the long relationship, but it is often the English adoption of Indian food is often not necessarily a sign of multiculturalism, is it? Because it's almost like a fight to own it. And I might be wrong. It's, about we created the chicken tikka masala. It's about owning it,
yeah,
the Birmingham Balti. And it isn't about necessarily accepting the Indians that come along with it. There's a separation between the food and the people. The same person who loves the Indian meal may not necessarily like Indians in the country or like
yeah.
Indians themselves. And on the other side, they may love both. I mean, I'm not saying each person is the same, but I'm just talking about how those two trends could be separated.
Absolutely. I
Uh,
think it's yeah. I think that does. I can't say that I've experienced this. I know. I think in the general ether, it exists.
yeah. And then now recently the food is going beyond. It is as the world is becoming smaller, on one hand we're all, you know you can't avoid co-optation. You are going to absorb from each other. People are going to start doing yoga and then doing goat yoga and hot yoga and doing whatever, and we
Yeah,
can be um, um dismayed by what yoga is becoming, and we can fight about cultural appropriation, but it is exactly just an accelerated form of what has happened in the past. As you move around and you adopt and you absorb, and even the Indian food in different places is now starting to evolve and try to cater to a different audience, right, or a consumer base. In America, the second generation is starting to own it. But what is happening is that there is a core set of dishes that are becoming accepted, whereas maybe those nuanced dishes that you had that were very local to the place that your family came from, those are not necessarily being adopted as much, but something new might come out. And in England, I hear of, you might have butter chicken in a sandwich, or you
oh,
might
right,
have
yeah.
something, also fusion and things like that. And that is also how identity is evolving, as you're thinking of yourself maybe not so much fractured as much as melded. um
Yeah,
over
true.
time where you can own all of it, right?
So, my culinary connection to Fiji and generally as a whole is, it starts with my grandmother. She became known as Mitainani. She had some
Mithai
sweet
nani.
Mitainani. She had confectionery carts that she kind of took over this little business in Fiji, and she would have these market stalls, and she had 2 or 3 carts by the end, and she would be going to the festivals and creating all these sweets and then catering functions and having food stalls at markets. And it was again this intuitive way of measuring. I think when I was last back in Fiji, my mum was teaching me how to make barfi, which is one of my
Barfi,
favorite.
yeah, yeah, I love
Yeah,
barfi.
I love barfi. And there's a
Is this is a milk barfi, right? The dairy
yes,
where there's
yes.
so many variations. Yeah.
It's a milk barfi, and then in Australia we have this kind of topping called hundreds and thousands. It's like
Okay.
confetti colored little like sugar little drops. And I think it's so distinct to me to have that from Australia in that way. But my mother was teaching me how to make the sugar syrup that gets folded in this particular
Yeah.
way. But the style of measuring was like taking the sugar syrup in your hand and separating it to see how many
Yeah, to
prongs
see if it's ready. Yeah, the
to see how many
consistency.
prongs. It's 3, you have 3, it's too much. If you have 2, it's just enough. Like things like that, these ways of intuitive measuring and stuff that have, passed down through by hand and
Yeah.
and orally, I thought that was fascinating. This is the one place I think, in the kitchen, like when I finish a big project or I have had an intense period of my life or in work, the way I reset is always in the kitchen. It's always
Yeah.
cooking some meal that's, elaborate or, that just takes a lot of concentration, but it takes me into a place and resets me, and I feel very comfortable in being intuitive in a kitchen.
Yeah.
I'm never fearful of whether I have enough or not enough because I know I can balance. It's one of those places, few places that
Yeah.
I really feel like I have complete ease and control. But I
Yeah.
wanted to
That's
I wanted
that's
to tell you because I didn't know if there was any particular Indo-Fijian dishes that I recalled, but I know that we had like making a curry from tinned mackerel, we
Mhm.
or tinned fish
Mm.
or canned, mutton. There was these which were kind of like, staples, but affordable, but the tastiest meals, that were devised. And I don't know particularly if that is uh Indo-Fijian or if that is global, but certainly they were some of the tastiest curries and very, very budget. But I also remember my mother had adapted. She'd made one of her favorite dishes actually is a tuna samosa.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's like a tuna fish curry in a samosa.
Wow.
And so
Samosa is one of the most adaptable concepts, and it's not originally Indian. It's just now become so Indian. It came from Persia,
right.
or at least some sort of concept of a pastry that is rolled up with the stuffing inside came from Persia, and it had a name, samosa. When I was at business school, we were launching the South Asian Business Association, and we'd been invited at the launch party a lot of other students from different backgrounds. And two of my Israeli friends looked at the samosas being served and said, "Oh, why are you serving an Israeli dish?" And it was the samosa. And I was like, "Hey, this is samosa. This is from India." It was a very interesting conversation then. Um, to realize that they didn't realize that Indians have samosas because they knew the Israeli version of it. But yeah, and then when I followed the story, I realized so some of these, the samosa with tuna, I'm not surprised at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think Lisbon is also famous for a lot of samosas because of after the Portuguese left in 1967, they left Goa in 1967. Many of them emigrated to Mozambique, which was also a Portuguese colony. And after that was freed, many of them double emigrated to Portugal and took samosas back with them.
Oh, wow.
The streets of Lisbon are famous for it. And then again, they've been adapted. But yeah, I'd love to try the tuna samosas one day.
Yeah. We need to
Yeah,
adapt this into a cooking show. I mean,
yeah,
I'm so intrigued to see how staples that we have, I think things like dal, that are so stapled, yet they're so different depending on where in the world that they're made.
yeah.
And I find that quite fascinating.
Yeah, and every day I mean, my husband and I these days are empty nesters, so we're concocting different recipes. We feel like making a dal. We don't want to follow the recipe because it's a lot of effort. But whatever we end up doing is intrinsically Indian in its treatment, just by instinct. There'll be some ginger, garlic, something with a little pepper because I want a shortcut, and it'll be on top like a tarka, but it's still it's probably the first time we made it that way, but it's still going to taste Indian.
Yeah.
And that is the thing about Indian cooking. It isn't set recipes. It takes a lot of other ingredients, but there's a core in it, which too has evolved with Persian influences, local Indian influences, and even Central Asian influences with, the Mughals, and that were very fond of food coming to India, and the royal kitchens also pandering to their desire for fine dining and such.
Yeah, and I mean, this is the thing. It's like I think that there's a power in diversity and things melding together. I'm a really big fan of Thai cuisine, but my Thai cuisine again has my Indian hand that makes it, so it
Yeah,
somehow becomes Thai and Indian. But that's the same as Malay curries, and
yeah,
places around the world, and the way that Indian cuisine changes. Um, globally, and it
yeah,
becomes has its own identity, which I think, I think Fiji and Indian cuisine,
yeah,
it has its own, it does have a very distinct flavor that I
yeah,
haven't, having traveled throughout India a lot and several times, I couldn't place where in India I tasted most like the food in Fiji, I mean, this dish that I made, when we met, actually, there's a romanticized way for me to look at it, because it really encapsulates the bit of Fiji and the island, because it has this coconut cream in it, and it also represents Australia because we have such good prawns there, so shrimp.
yeah. Well,
We it kind of is this culmination of my history, and then a meal that when I make, takes me back to my heritage,
yeah.
being Australian and then Fijian.
Thing about Indian food is, when you're saying this particular recipe represents your heritage and history, it'll be true that I may not have eaten the exact dish, or we wouldn't have eaten that exact dish. But there is something core to Indian cooking that is reminiscent of other dishes you've had. In India, restaurants were not a thing till very late because of the caste system, where different groups don't want to eat with other groups. My
Right.
son is a student at University of Chicago, and he met somebody of Indian origin from another country, they go back and forth between India and there. But they very proudly talk about how their grandfather, when had to move outside the country, took over Brahmin cook. So if you
Yeah,
want your
right.
food also to be cooked by somebody who is from the same caste as you, and if some people are holding on to that you can imagine how difficult it is for a restaurant culture to emerge. I was born in the 70s, and then even in the 80s, I mean, it's not that restaurants weren't there, but it was slowly coming about, and the restaurant food was a certain kind of food, and South Indian food had a certain repertoire. The Udupis were the first sort of fast food chains, but they would have a dosa and idli and a few expected dishes. I had no clue till the 90s about even the diversity in the South. If you went to the South, and I traveled around with my parents, I could not find there would be one restaurant all of Trivandrum with North Indian food, and it would taste nothing like, the
Wow.
holy grail of North Indian food. All those rules would be violated. Like, but there's no whole wheat in our rotis, we use maida, and you're like, "Oh, I can't have this stretchy bread." So it's now that everybody's celebrating regionalism in India as well, and even in the US, while I talked about the second generation and a core set of dishes becoming celebrated and preserved, Indian cooks from India, chains are opening up that are really going away from a standard Indian menu. And there is, restaurants like the Maka that had suddenly 1,500 people on the wait list that you had never heard of from Indian food. So again, that regionalism is coming
um,
about at the same time, celebrating very unique stories of, this is snail curry from Tamil Nadu. And so that circles back to what you're saying about your heritage and your specific dish.
yeah,
But there is something core in the way they cook it. That keeps the Indianness, and that's why when you're saying, when you make a Thai curry, you add that Indian touch to it. The evolution is, what it is, right?
absolutely, absolutely, and yeah, that the fish that I'd made, I think this again, the fried fish reminds, it takes me back to Fiji and how my mother would prepare it, because
Yeah.
we used to go fishing a lot, and so it would be the particular type of fish that they caught, and make it in this kind of dry spiced marinade. And
Yeah.
that particular masala that I was using was, when I would go when I go and visit home, usually, we get together in the kitchen, and I think it was the time before last that my mother had actually was teaching me how to make masala. So she was heating up the whole spices before crushing them, and she was telling me how much of the to add, and there was such an intuitive way of how much um how to measure the amount of spices, but also how to measure how these intuitive ways of how knowing when things are ready, when it's not too brown or just brown enough, or it's
Yeah.
just popping or not popping. And in turn hearing the stories as they're making this food, I thought that was really
And that point that you made, that is why the Indian curry powder is something no self-respecting Indian will use, because the spices cannot be lumped together. There's a sequence to how they have to be put in, and something has to be roasted more, something has to be roasted less. Otherwise, it won't taste the same according to people, and they'll always talk about how it's made in their home versus somebody else's home.
that's right.
And but ironically, all the ingredients that the diaspora wants to hold on to as theirs, like even in Fiji, I read that if there's an authentic curry, they will want to use their own ingredients. Like if potatoes are being used, they will wait for the potatoes before replacing it with taro or something or any other ingredient. But ironically, potatoes, tomatoes, cauliflower, green beans, red chili powder, all these ingredients came to South Asia, were brought either by the British or the Portuguese. And many of these recipes themselves are not that old. So that begs the question of authenticity, because some of them just arrived, the ingredients came to India in the 1800s. And then you have the diaspora taking it all over the world. It evolves a little bit, but there's also this holding on to some of the core values, and along with it your recipes, because you identify with it, and it's just such a beautiful story of how things will continue to evolve, and you give and you take and you hold on.
That's
um,
right.
and identities will keep fracturing and welding. So tell us, before I end, tell us about Hamlet. What's the reception so far? What was it like working on it? I'm
Oh,
super
wow.
excited to see it when it comes to the US.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited for it to be out in the world. I mean that it's a South Asian adaptation of Hamlet, and it's set in London, um, within a company called Elsinore, which is like a property developing company. Riz Ahmed plays
Yeah,
Hamlet, and it's directed by Neil Carrier. And it's set within a it's so interesting because we all know the story of Hamlet. I've known about it for years, but when you put it in an Indian setting, in a South Asian
yeah,
setting, all of a sudden it makes complete sense. The melodrama makes so much sense that a brother has killed his brother to marry the brother's wife, and the son is going to try and take revenge. And the crux of the story makes so much sense in this interpretation. And then also, the visually to use the Indian wedding as the ceremonies, and the Indian kind of funeral, having it
yeah,
interpreted in this way was really, like, it was so special because it was, again, seeing uh, this classical text, evolve, like cuisine evolves, to see it
yeah, yeah,
with an Indian hand cooking it up was something so incredibly amazing to me to be part of, and also to be, part of, again, reconnecting on another level with my culture in that sense.
yeah,
Yeah, it was truly, truly special. And then also, I think that Neil, the director, the gaze that you see this film through,
yeah.
there's this beautiful restraint to it. It's really elegant uh, presentation of Hamlet.
Yeah, so and it proves that all these universal themes that you see in the classics, so the moment you transplant it in another culture, you realize that it's common to everybody. You just haven't, you just need to apply a different lens to it, right?
That's right.
Um, yeah, and it just makes it even more true. And hopefully, so I'm super excited. I've seen the trailer. I can't wait. I think it's coming out in April.
Yes,
In the
April
US,
10th
is
in
it?
US.
April 10th. Perfect. Looking forward to it. Thank you so much. Best of luck for the movie. Can't wait to see that and much more work from you, Neeraj, and looking forward to meeting you soon
Yeah,
somewhere
great. Another meal.
over another meal. Yeah. Thank you so much.